What do you think the lessons are of the last couple cycles that you've seen from an investor standpoint? We've got a lot of young kids out there. You've lived through multiple cycles in the 50, 60 years plus you've been investing, 70 years investing. What are the lessons and what, these are young people, what should they take away?
The lessons are that people will continue to make the same mistakes they've made. I mean, humans, it doesn't correlate to IQ particularly. I mean, when they get greedy, and we had this huge bubble in the most important asset the American public has, housing. I mean, so you had a huge bubble in something you could borrow heavily against. So you could run a margin account effect on a house instead of stocks, and the conditions got very lax. So when that bubble popped, but people came into that gradually. When they get fearful, it happens all at once. I mean, when people get scared, they all want to leave at one time. And we had them all want to leave at one time, and that'll happen again. It'll happen with a different set of circumstances, but the human animal will keep behaving pretty much the way it has in the past. So we will have periodic recessions. We'll have an occasional panic, which all recessions don't come from panics. But the good news is, if you look at the 20th century, we had 2 world wars, we had the Great Depression, we had the flu epidemic, we had the Cold War, we had the atom bomb, you name it. The Dow Jones average went from 66 to 11,497. With all these terrible things happening supposedly at various times. America works. And when I bought my first stock when I was 11, that was in the spring of 1942, and that was a couple months after Pearl Harbor, and we were getting clobbered in the Pacific at Corregidor and Bataan. I mean, the Death March of Bataan, and in the European theater, the Blitz of England was on, and the Dow was at about 100. But just look at where we are now. I mean, the country really works. The trick is, it seems to me, the obligation of a society as prosperous as ours is to figure out how nobody gets left too far behind.
Right. It was interesting because last year Bono's speech was a lot about how America is a society of dreams and you can accomplish more here. It was actually one of the best speeches about the optimism America could have by a person who's not American by birth. And I know you carry that optimism. So after all this, what makes you most optimistic for the next decade about America?
Just imagine, 1789, just go back just a few hundred years. There wasn't anything here, I mean, in this country. And, Sir Christopher Wren, I think, designed St. Paul's Cathedral, is buried there, and there's a little plaque there, and it says, if you seek my monument, look about you. Well, I said, if you seek America's monument, look about you. This country has all come about in a few hundred years. We had less than 4 million people, when we became a country. China had 300 million people at that time. Europe had about 75 million. They were just as smart as we were. They worked just as hard as we did. They had natural resources that were similar to ours, and yet we ended up with a quarter of the world's GDP, a few hundred years later. We've got something that works, and we don't want to mess that up. We want to figure out what we do with this abundance better as we go along. But you don't have to worry about the system working. But you will have periodic recessions, and you will have an occasional panic brought on by something that who knows where it comes from. And the thing to remember at that time, I wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in the fall of 2008, and I said, the country will come back. It'll go through a big recession and everything, but it'll come back, and it's coming back. So don't ever worry about America. It'll tell you you're in the right place.
You've been famous for your investment strategy basically that follows the opposite side of that principle is invest when the chips are down, and that served you well. So what's your favorite time that you were able to accomplish that, when you caught somebody down?
I always think my favorite time's going to be tomorrow. It's always been fun. There's a company here in Washington called Geico, and I first got exposed to that in 1950. I was 19 years old. Well, it was 51, I'm sorry. I was 20 years old. And I came down on a Saturday because I'd learned that my professor who I worshiped at Columbia named Ben Graham was the chairman. I got down here and the door was locked. When I went to the building, because it was Saturday, and I pounded on the door, and some janitor let me in, and a marvelous fellow named Lorimer Davidson spent 4 hours with me teaching me all about insurance. And he helped me so much in life. You're going to get helped by some wonderful people in life. It's a great thing to remember later on when you get to be my age, that all the help you've received from different people, because nobody does it alone. Obama got in trouble when he said that in the campaign, that nobody does it by themselves. Nobody does do it by themselves. We all sit in the shade of trees that were planted by others. So it's obligatory, I think, to plant a few trees ourselves if we've had good luck. It's been a great ride, but it's not over.
When did you invest in Geico the first time?
Geico, I bought Lorimer Davidson when I was finishing up at Columbia, and then I started selling securities when I got out. And I went out to my Aunt Alice. My Aunt Alice would have bought anything from me. And so she bought 100 shares of government employees insurance. It was the first stock I ever sold. And a lot of years passed, and Mr. Davidson was very kind to me in a variety of ways. But I went in different directions. And then in 1976, the company got in big trouble because they miscalculated their reserves, and they were going broke. And so I came back here, and I bought a third of the company in the market in a very short period of time. And then in 1995, by now our third had become a half because they'd repurchased their shares. And I went out to see Mr. Davidson, who was out in Bethesda. He was 96 or 97. And he had a bunch of stock in Geico with no cost basis because he'd held it forever. And I said, Davey, if I make an offer for this company for cash, you're going to pay a big tax. And of course, if you die with the stock, you don't have that tax and you get a stepped up basis. So I'm not going to make this offer unless it's all right with you. And he said to me, he said, Warren, he said, I've hoped for this all my life. And so we bought the rest of the company. He was a great man.
What are your best memories about being around Georgetown? And
Well, I delivered papers at Georgetown Hospital 66 years ago. And I developed this affinity because in the hospital, people tipped. My regular customers, the one that knew me, never tipped. But I would go to the hospital, and one of the things they would do, they would give me cash tips, but they also would tell me if they were a woman that had given birth, baby that was, we'll say, 8 pounds, 11 ounces, they would whisper that number to me. And the numbers racket was very big in Washington that time, and they felt they were giving me this terribly valuable information, the exact time in which the baby was born or something. And I was supposed to bet on that number in the numbers racket that day. So I have a lot of memories of Georgetown, and I was here during World War II, which was really a fascinating time to be in Washington. And my dad being in Congress, it was really a window on extraordinary time in America. And of course, at that time, we were probably more united than at any time in my lifetime about a common goal. I mean, that was the time when people like Bobby Feller and all the athletes, the day the war broke out, went down and enlisted, and people really did voluntarily in a very high percentage play by the rules in terms of gasoline rationing and sugar rationing and meat rationing and all that. We all bought savings bonds at school to help out the troops. So it was quite a period.
Somewhere along there, you started investing. And I've read stories that you started investing at 13, or whether they're true or not. But what created the fascination with investing?
It took me 5 years. I had to save $120. It took me 5 years to get the $120 to buy a stock, 3 shares of City Service Preferred when I was 11. My dad originally was in the investment business. He really wasn't very interested in it. But I would go down on Saturday morning, and he had these books there in the office, and I read all those. And then I went to the Omaha Public Library, and I read every book on investments in the Omaha Public Library by the time we moved to Washington. And then when we got here, I had the Library of Congress. I read everything, and I just found it fascinating. And incidentally, I find it fascinating today. I mean, it's an activity. If you're a baseball player or something, your legs may go or something. Well, my legs have long gone, but it doesn't make any difference in what I do. So I literally have I always have had fun working, but I have as much fun now as I've ever had in my life. I mean, I work with people I love doing what I love, and it just doesn't get any better than that.
Well, the quote is that you tap dance to work.
Incidentally, it was nice to get that round of applause at the start, but I've learned that crowds now applaud at the start because I'm 83 and they're not sure I'll be around at the end of the talk.